The first snow had come early that year, heavy and relentless, swallowing the Montana mountains in silence. To most, it meant warmth by a fire, full larders, and the laughter of neighbors. But for Clara Dane, it meant only one thing: another season of survival. Her cabin sat crooked against the slope of Black Elk Ridge, built from rough logs and patched with whatever she could find. The roof sagged under the weight of snow, and the smoke that escaped the chimney was faint, barely enough to promise warmth inside. The forest surrounded her in thick, endless pine, the kind of quiet that could drive a person mad if they weren't already half there. Clara had been alone for nearly 2 years, alone since the fire. Her right cheek and jaw were twisted with a burn scar that ran down her neck, a reminder of the night flames devoured her home, her husband, and her baby boy. She had crawled through the fire, half blind with her child in her arms. But when she reached the snow outside, the boy wasn't breathing. People said the fire was her punishment, that she had married a drunk and stayed too long. Others said the devil himself marked her face as a warning. They stopped saying it to her face the day she aimed her rifle at a traitor who called her the scarred widow. Now, she lived as the wolves did, quiet, wary, and alone. That morning, her fingers ached from cold as she skinned the rabbit caught in her snare. The knife slipped once, drawing a thin line of blood on her palm, but she didn't flinch. She hadn't flinched in a long time. The cut would heal. Everything did eventually except the soul. When she looked up, snow began falling again, light and soft, like ash. She stood scanning the tree line. The deer track she'd followed the day before had vanished overnight, and her traps would soon freeze shut. The second winter was worse than the first, colder, longer, lonelier. Inside the cabin, she had just enough supplies for a month if she stretched them. Dried venison, cornmeal, a few jars of beans she'd traded last fall. The water barrel was half frozen, and the firewood pile too low for comfort. She'd need to hunt again soon, though her legs still ached from the last trek down to the creek. Her scar itched in the dry air. She tied a strip of cloth over her face before stepping outside again. The cloth didn't hide the scar completely, but it spared her the sting of the cold and the shame she still carried, even with no one left to see. A raven cawed from a branch above, black against the white sky. Clara paused, hand tightening on the rifle. She'd learned to read the forest. Ravens meant fresh tracks or sometimes fresh death. She followed the sound down the slope, boots crunching through crusted snow. The air was sharp, thin, the kind that burned the lungs. 100 yards from her cabin, she found what had drawn the bird, a frozen doe, half-eaten by wolves. The remains would make for bait if she was careful. Wolves meant furs, and furs meant trade. But as she crouched to set her snare, a strange unease pricked her neck. The forest had gone too still. She straightened slowly, rifle lifted. Beyond the trees, something moved, a flicker of dark cloth, a glint of metal. Her heart thudded once hard. Few men ventured this far into the ridge this time of year. Those who did rarely came for good reason. Clara cocked the rifle, finger steady on the trigger. "Show yourself," she called into the snow. Her voice cracked from disuse. "You've got one chance." Only the wind answered, then faintly she heard it, a horse's breath, ragged and real. The sound of hooves sinking deep into snow. She stepped back, raised her rifle higher. "Turn around," she warned, "or I'll send you back down the mountain with a hole in your hat." Somewhere beyond the trees, a man's voice carried low and steady. "Easy, ma'am. I'm not here to harm you." But she didn't lower the gun. She learned the hard way. Words were cheaper than bullets, and both could kill. The snow fell thicker now, veiling him from sight. And though she didn't yet know it, that stranger's voice, the man who would change everything, belonged to Elias Boone, the rich mountain man who would one day refuse to let her go. The man's voice came again through the snow, deep and steady, with the calm of someone who'd spent his life in wild country. "Clara Dane," he called. "Don't shoot. It's Elias Boone." The sound of that name hit her like a spark in the dark. She hadn't heard it in years, since before the fire, before her world had burned to ash. Once, Elias Boone had been a familiar sight in town, a tall, broad man with a slow smile and a reputation for fortune. He traded pelts and horses all the way from the Canadian border to the southern trails, coming back with gold coins, fine whiskey, and stories too wild to believe. But he'd left before her life fell apart, riding west to start a trading company. He'd been a friend of her husband once, at least until he saw what her husband truly was. Now, That same man was walking up the ridge toward her cabin, leading a snow-dusted horse, his breath a plume of white in the freezing air. "Don't come any closer," Clara said, tightening her grip on the rifle. He stopped where the snow rose to his knees. His coat was thick fur trimmed with leather, the kind a rich man could afford, but his eyes, when she caught them through the curtain of snow, were the same gray-blue as the winter sky, unmoved, steady, and kind. "I heard you were still up here," Elias said. Didn't believe it at first. Most said no one could survive 2 winters alone. "I manage." "So I see." His gaze drifted to the faint smoke rising from her chimney, then back to her face. "But you're half frozen and 1 storm from dead." Her jaw tightened. "Then let the storm do its work." "I didn't ask for company." He smiled faintly, sadly even. "No, you never did." He took a slow step closer, testing her silence. She didn't lower the rifle. "What do you want, Elias?" she demanded. Wanted to see if the stories were true. His tone was softer now. That Clara Dane, who once played the piano at the church and baked pies for every social, was living up here like a ghost. Her pulse stung her throat. "The woman you knew burned to death in that fire. You're talking to what's left." Something flickered in his eyes then, something like hurt. He didn't argue. Instead, he reached into his saddlebag and drew out a small sack. "Coffee," he said, tossing it into the snow between them. "And sugar. Thought maybe you'd forgotten what either tastes like." She stared at the sack but didn't move. Elias shifted the reins in his gloved hand. "I'll leave it here then. No harm done." He turned as if to go, but the snow was falling harder now, thick and fast, the kind that could bury a man and horse if they lingered too long on the open ridge. Clara saw the way his horse shivered, saw frost already icing on his coat. "You'll freeze before you make it back down," she said reluctantly. He looked over his shoulder, half smiling. Wouldn't be the first time. She hesitated, then jerked her chin toward the cabin. "You can stable your horse in the shed. 1 night only." He nodded, saying nothing more. Inside the cabin, Clara busied herself with the fire as he brushed snow off his shoulders and crouched to warm his hands. The silence between them stretched taut, filled with the hiss of wet wood and the wind outside. Elias looked around the room, at the crude shelves, the patched blankets, the cracked window covered with hide. Everything bore the mark of her survival. She'd built this life from ruin. He could see that. "You've done well," he said quietly. "I've done what I had to." He nodded again, and something in his expression softened. An understanding, a respect. Then he took the coffee pot from her shelf and started brewing as if he'd never left. Clara watched him warily, scar hidden beneath her scarf. The years had carved his face deeper, but there was still a steadiness in him she recognized. A kind of strength that didn't come from money or muscle. As the smell of coffee filled the cabin, she realized for the first time in 2 winters that her heart was not as numb as she'd believed. Elias Boone had returned to the mountains, and whether she liked it or not, he had brought warmth with him. By morning, the storm had settled into a gray stillness. Snow clung to the trees like breath held too long, and the air outside Clara's cabin was sharp enough to cut through bone. She stirred the fire and glanced at the man asleep in the corner. Elias Boone, the uninvited guest who'd somehow made it through the night without freezing or being thrown out. He'd slept sitting up, hat pulled low, 1 hand on his rifle. Even in rest, he looked like a man who'd learned not to trust the dark. His horse, she knew, was stabled behind the cabin, probably eating through what little hay she'd saved. Clara's instinct was to tell him to leave before the sun rose high. But as she looked out the frosted window, she saw the truth. The storm had buried the trails. It would be suicide to send him away now. She bundled up, pulled on her cracked leather boots, and slung her rifle over her shoulder. Elias stirred as she opened the door. "Going somewhere?" he asked, voice rough from sleep. "Checking my traps." "I'll come with you." She turned, glare sharp as ice. "You'll stay put." "I don't need help." He stood, tall and calm, brushing the snow from his coat. "Wasn't offering help. Just company. Wolves have been bold this winter." That made her pause. The howls at night had been getting closer, their echoes circling the ridge like ghosts. She didn't want to admit it, but a second gun might be useful. With a small nod, she pushed open the door. The cold hit them like a hammer. The snow was thigh-deep in places, the trees bowed under its weight. They moved in silence down the narrow trail, breath rising in steady clouds. Clara led the way, steps sure and quiet, her rifle at the ready. After half a mile, she crouched near a snare hidden beneath a drift. The trap was sprung and empty. Blood stained the snow. Fox, maybe, Elias murmured. Or something bigger. Clara scanned the trees. The forest had that strange silence again, the kind that meant watching eyes. She loaded another round into her rifle. "Keep moving," she whispered. They reached her second trap near a frozen creek. This one wasn't empty. A deer hung tangled, its throat torn open. The snow around it was churned with paw prints, large ones. "Wolves," Elias said, crouching to study the tracks. "A whole pack." Before she could answer, a low growl rippled through the air. Then another. Shadows slipped between the pines, gray, silent, fast. "Get back to the rocks," Elias ordered, raising his rifle. Clara moved quickly, heart pounding. The first wolf lunged from the side, jaws snapping. Her shot rang out sharp and true. The beast dropped, rolling into the snow. Another darted toward Elias, teeth flashing white. He fired once, clean through the chest. The others circled, snarling, hungry and desperate. Clara felt the cold sweat beneath her gloves as she reloaded. One wolf leapt straight for her throat, too close, too fast. Elias shoved her aside, the wolf crashing into him. They hit the ground hard, snow flying. "Elias!" she shouted, aiming. But before she could fire, his knife flashed and the wolf went still. For a moment, all she could hear was her heartbeat and the heavy breathing of the last two wolves retreating into the trees. The silence returned, cold, eerie, complete. Elias pushed himself up, chest heaving. Blood stained his sleeve, but it wasn't his own. He met her eyes, calm even in the aftermath. "You all right?" Clara nodded, though her hands trembled. "You shouldn't have. Saved your life?" He smiled faintly. Old habit. She glared at him, but something unspoken flickered between them. Something that wasn't quite anger. They dragged the deer carcass back toward the cabin. By the time they reached it, Clara's muscles burned and the world felt smaller, sharper, alive. She'd faced hunger and cold before, but never this, never danger shared, nor the heat of another human's nearness after years of solitude. Inside, she lit the fire again, hands shaking slightly as she poured water into the kettle. Elias sat across from her, watching the flames dance. "Looks like we'll eat well tonight," he said softly. Clara didn't answer. She only nodded, staring into the fire. She had survived 2 winters alone, but now, she wasn't sure she wanted to face another one that way. By the time they returned to the cabin, the sky had cleared, leaving a pale, brittle sunlight reflecting off the snow. Clara's cabin, small and weather-worn, looked even lonelier against the bright, frozen landscape. The fire crackled in the hearth, giving off warmth that clawed at her frozen fingers. She set the deer down carefully, her hands still trembling from adrenaline. Elias knelt beside the carcass, inspecting it, but his eyes kept drifting toward her. Clara noticed, and it made her pulse skip in a way that annoyed her. She hated the way anyone looked at her now. Her scar, rough and pink, ran along her cheek and jaw, twisting the delicate contours of her face. It had been a shield as much as a curse. No one looked past it, and that suited her just fine. She tied a scarf around her face, tucking her hair into it, making sure no skin showed. The scar was hers and hers alone. No man, no stranger would touch it or even speak of it. "You don't have to cover that," Elias said gently, crouched by the fire, knife in hand as he cleaned the deer. His voice carried that same calm, steady confidence he always had. Clara froze. "What?" she asked, suspicion sharpening her tone. "That scar," he said slowly. "It doesn't frighten me." Her hands stilled. The firelight flickered across his face, highlighting the lines that years in the mountains had carved. He wasn't lying, she could see it in his eyes. There was no pity there, no faint curiosity, no whispered warning of the townspeople she had long grown used to. Only respect. I don't need your sympathy," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "You think it's impressive or something?" He shook his head. "I think it tells a story. You survived what most people wouldn't even see. That takes pride, Clara. Pride and strength." Clara's throat tightened. Strength. She had fought wolves, starvation and snowstorms. But this acknowledgement from someone who had seen the world beyond the ridge, made her feel exposed. She turned away, arranging the firewood and trying to keep her fingers busy. Elias didn't press. Instead, he began preparing a small meal from the deer, his hands steady, his movements deliberate. She watched him wary, but her heart betrayed her. For the first time in years, someone treated her not as a broken woman or a curiosity, but as a human being, someone who had endured and survived. The cabin, though small and cold, began to feel less like a tomb and more like a haven. Clara realized she had been holding herself prisoner, letting the scar define her, letting pride keep others at bay. Elias didn't care about the scar. He cared about her, the woman behind it. And for reasons she could not name, that knowledge both frightened and thrilled her. He handed her a cup of hot broth, the steam curling around her face. She accepted it reluctantly, taking a small sip. Warmth spread through her chest, though not just from the liquid. "You've done well to last this long," he said softly, leaning back against the log wall. "Most people would have given up. You didn't. That's why you're still here." Clara met his eyes, and in the firelight for the first time, she let herself see him. Not the rich mountain man, not the stranger, but the man who had once known her world and now stood steadfast beside it. "I survived because I had to," she said quietly, almost to herself. "Not because anyone cared." Elias's smile was gentle. "Well, I care now, and I'm not going anywhere." She turned her gaze back to the fire, the words echoing in her mind. She wanted to push him away, wanted to insist that she was enough alone. But something about his presence, his quiet strength, made the thought impossible. The fire crackled between them, a fragile bridge, a promise of warmth she hadn't felt in years. For the first time, Clara realized that the scar on her face, the mark of her past, of loss, of fire, was not just a reminder of death. It was proof she had survived, proof she could endure, and maybe, just maybe, it could be a bridge to something she had long denied herself: connection, trust, and the possibility of being seen without shame. Elias looked at her again, eyes steady. "Rest," he said. "We have a long winter ahead and you're not facing it alone." Clara clenched her hands around the scarf, her pulse thrumming in her chest. She didn't answer, but deep inside she felt the first flicker of something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. The scar was still there, but so was pride. And for the first time in 2 winters, the two no longer felt like enemies. The snow continued to fall in thick, muffling sheets, blanketing the ridge in cold silence. Clara Dane stared out the cabin window, tracing the delicate patterns of frost along the glass. She had hunted, trapped, and endured more than most women could imagine, but the storm had trapped her inside with a stranger, a man she had no reason to trust yet could not force out. Elias Boone leaned against the wall, his rifle resting across his knees. He was cleaning his boots with the slow precision of a man used to careful work, though his eyes never left the fire. Clara caught herself studying him. His movements were deliberate, controlled, confident. He was nothing like the men who had mocked or feared her in town. He was different, dangerous in a way she didn't fully understand, but dependable. She finally spoke, her voice low and cautious. "You can stay 1 night. After that, you leave." Elias raised an eyebrow, the hint of a smile tugging at his lips. "1 night only, I'll hold you to it." She didn't answer, retreating to the stove to warm a small pot of coffee. The aroma filled the cabin, mixing with the scent of burning wood, and Clara felt a flicker of comfort she hadn't known in years. She set 2 tin cups on the rough-hewn table and gestured for him to sit. The first sip of hot liquid warmed her fingers, and she noticed Elias watching her, unflinching, steady. The silence stretched, not awkward, but alive, like a thin wire charged with something unspoken. "You should eat something," he said softly, gesturing to the scraps of venison she had prepared. "The storm isn't letting up anytime soon, and the snow is deep outside." Clara shook her head. "I can manage. I've managed worse." "I'm sure you have," he replied, eyes meeting hers. "But surviving isn't the same as thriving. You're not a trapper or a soldier, you're a woman, and that means you don't have to face everything alone." She looked away, jaw tight, heart thumping. She wanted to argue, wanted to push him away, but the thought of another night facing the storm alone made her pause. Her pride rebelled, but her body and her fear recognized the truth. She needed him. Reluctantly, she agreed. "All right, you stay tonight, but that's all." The evening stretched long. Snow beat against the roof in steady rhythm, wind howling across the ridge. Clara and Elias worked in quiet partnership, mending a torn blanket, sharpening knives, stacking firewood. Words were few, but each action spoke volumes. She began to notice how his presence eased the endless tension in her muscles, how his calm strength gave her a sense of security she hadn't felt since before the fire. When darkness fully settled, the storm still raging outside, Elias produced a small lantern. Its soft light revealed the lines of her scar, and Clara instinctively tugged her scarf tighter. "You don't have to hide it," he said quietly, almost a whisper. "I'm not going anywhere, and I'm not afraid." Her pulse skipped. She had spent years hiding, ashamed and wary, yet this man treated her scar not as a flaw but as part of her story. The realization both unsettled and intrigued her. "Why?" she asked finally, voice barely audible. "Because it matters little what the world thinks of you," he replied. "I know the truth of who you are, and that's enough." For the first time in nearly 2 years, Clara allowed herself to relax. She set aside her rifle, poured another cup of coffee, and sat across from him. The storm raged outside, yet inside the cabin a fragile warmth grew, born not of the fire, but of trust slowly beginning to root itself between two solitary souls. By nightfall, the deal was settled, not through words, but through shared survival. Clara would let him stay. Elias would respect her boundaries. And though neither spoke of it, both knew that the bond forged in the firelight and snowstorm was only the beginning. The storm would last, the cold would bite, and the ridge would remain treacherous. But together, they would endure. And for the first time in years, Clara allowed herself to imagine that surviving didn't have to mean facing the world alone. The storm had subsided by the next evening, leaving the world outside Clara's cabin transformed. Snow clung to every branch and draped the mountains in silence, broken only by the occasional crack of an ice-laden branch. Inside, the cabin smelled of wood smoke, venison, and the faint tang of iron from the deer's blood. Clara Dane sat near the fire, mending a tear in her worn coat while Elias Boone sat across from her, sharpening a knife with slow, methodical strokes. For a long time, neither spoke. Words felt unnecessary. The silence had become a fragile bridge between them, one that neither wanted to shatter. Yet beneath it, a tension lingered, one that wasn't just fear, hunger, or cold. It was something heavier, something raw and unresolved. Clara finally set down her needle. Her fingers trembled slightly, not from the cold but from the memory she could no longer contain. "Elias," she began, her voice low, almost trembling. "There's something I need to tell you." He paused, knife suspended mid-air, and looked at her with steady gray-blue eyes. "Whatever it is," he said quietly, "you can tell me." She swallowed, trying to summon the courage she had needed so many times before. "The fire. It wasn't an accident. My husband, he said it." The words fell heavy between them. Her eyes flitted to the fire, the dancing flames casting jagged shadows across her scarred face. "I tried to save our child. I tried. But I couldn't. He died. And I—" Her voice broke. "I survived. But everything else was lost." Elias remained silent, listening. Not with pity, not with judgment, but with an understanding that unsettled her. Few people had ever met her without recoiling, without whispering about the scar or the curse it seemed to carry. But his gaze was steady, warm, and patient, as though he had already seen the worst the world could throw at her and knew it wouldn't define her. "You survived," he said finally, voice soft. "And that takes more courage than most people will ever know. Losing a child, a home, a life you loved. Yet you're still here. That's strength, Clara, not failure." She shook her head bitterly. "You don't understand. I failed him. I failed my husband. I failed myself. The world doesn't care about strength. It only notices what's broken." Elias leaned back, the knife resting across his knees. I do understand, he said. I've lost someone too. My brother. He died in the war. I've spent years trying to build a life that makes up for it. And yet, no matter what I do, the guilt follows. The truth is, Clara, survival alone isn't failure. It's proof that you've endured what others couldn't. For the first time in years, Clara didn't turn away. She let the words settle over her like a balm on old wounds. The firelight reflected in her tear-filled eyes, highlighting the rough, twisted scar that she had once believed made her unworthy of life or love. I don't know if I can ever forget, she admitted, or forgive myself. You don't have to, Elias said. You only have to live. And you're doing that every day. That's more than enough. The tension in her shoulders eased just a little. She watched him across the cabin, the man who had appeared in her wilderness like a lifeline, steady and unwavering. His presence reminded her that while the past could not be erased, it could be survived. And surviving didn't mean facing the world alone. For the first time since the fire, she allowed herself to imagine something else: trust, companionship, maybe even hope. Not as a replacement for her loss, but as a shield against the cold, empty years she had endured. Elias looked at her then, his expression gentle but firm. You've carried this for too long. Let someone share the burden. Clara's lips pressed together. The thought terrified her, yet beneath the fear stirred a fragile, almost imperceptible warmth. In the quiet of the snowbound cabin, two broken souls recognized a reflection of their own pain, and the beginning of a shared strength that neither had anticipated. The fire crackled between them, and for the first time in years, Clara Dane allowed herself to breathe without fear. The memory of fire remained, but now it was tempered by the possibility of life yet to come. Weeks passed, and the relentless grip of winter slowly loosened. Snow began to melt in the valleys, feeding the mountain streams with icy torrents. The sun, pale but persistent, warmed the frozen earth just enough to reveal the jagged outlines of rocks and trees hidden beneath the snow. For Clara Dane, this season of thawing brought relief, and an unease she could not ignore. Inside the cabin, life had settled into an uneasy rhythm. Clara and Elias moved together with a silent understanding, repairing the cabin, stacking firewood, and preparing food. Their meals were simple but nourishing, their conversations sparse but meaningful. The fire, always burning, was the heart of the small home, and the air was filled with the scent of venison, pine, and the faint tang of iron from their hunts. Clara had begun to feel something she hadn't in years, a fragile sense of safety. Yet the world beyond the ridge reminded her that safety was an illusion. She scanned the horizon from the cabin's tiny window, watching the snow retreat, revealing deer tracks, wolf tracks, and the faint signs of other travelers. One morning, as they worked together clearing a path for her traps, she noticed a change in the air, a tension that didn't belong to the thawing weather. The track she had followed for deer led to something unexpected: signs of human passage. Footprints, heavy and uneven, cut across the ridge, disturbing the quiet she had clung to. They're close, she murmured, gripping her rifle. Elias glanced over his shoulder, eyes narrowing. Raiders, he said quietly. Or desperate men looking for furs. Clara's stomach tightened. She had survived wolves, snow, and starvation, but humans, greedy, violent humans, were unpredictable. They could kill in a moment, taking what little she had left. That night, the threat became real. Clara heard the snap of a branch, the whisper of snow being crushed under boots. Before she could act, a man appeared at the edge of the clearing, rifle raised. Her heart raced, and she raised her own rifle in defense. Elias was already moving, swift and sure. He stepped into the open, rifle aimed, his presence a shield between Clara and the threat. The men were bold, but they hadn't counted on him. Gunfire shattered the still night, echoing off the mountains, and when it was over, the intruders lay wounded or fleeing into the darkness. Clara's hand shook as she lowered her rifle. One shot had grazed her shoulder, a shallow cut that burned with cold and fire. Elias quickly moved to her side, tearing a strip from his coat to bandage the wound. She tried to pull away, ashamed of the weakness that clung to her, but he held her gently with the patience of a man who had faced death, more times than he cared to count. You're safe, he said, voice low, steady. I won't let them take you. Her breath hitched, a mixture of fear, relief, and something deeper, something that scared her even more. She had survived 2 winters alone, relying only on her strength and wits. Yet here, in this small, snowbound cabin, she realized she did not have to face every danger alone. "You," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You came back." Elias's hand brushed her cheek, careful to avoid her scar. "Of course I did. I told you I wasn't leaving you to die. You've endured too much for me to let this ridge take you now." Clara closed her eyes, the adrenaline fading, leaving her raw and trembling. The cabin, once a place of solitude and survival, now felt like a refuge. For the first time, she understood that trust was not weakness. It was another kind of strength, one that required courage to accept. Outside, the snow continued to melt, revealing the harsh beauty of the mountains. Inside, by the fire, Clara allowed herself to lean against Elias, letting the warmth seep into her bones. The spring thaw was not just in the land, it was in her heart as well. For the first time in years, Clara Dane felt something she had long denied herself: the possibility of life beyond survival, of warmth beyond the fire, and of a man who would not let her face the world or death alone. The wound on Clara's shoulder throbbed faintly, a steady reminder of how close she had come to death that night. Snow had melted into slush outside, and the sun hung low over the ridge, painting the mountains with a soft golden haze. Inside the cabin, Clara sat near the fire, her hand pressed against the bandage Elias had wrapped with careful precision. She tried to focus on the warmth of the flames, on the rhythmic creak of the cabin as the wood settled, but her mind kept drifting back to the raid, the intruders, the bullets, the sudden, terrifying closeness of death. Elias moved quietly behind her, brushing snow from his coat. He had cleaned and reloaded his rifle, checking every strap and buckle as though preparing for another attack. Clara's pulse quickened at the sight of him, at the way he carried himself, so calm, so confident, so unshakable even after the night's violence. "You shouldn't have come back," she said softly, without turning. "I couldn't leave you," he replied, crouching beside her. "Not after last night." Not ever, her heart stuttered. She had spent 2 long winters surviving alone, convincing herself that relying on no one was her only path. But now, in the aftermath of danger, she realized she didn't want to face another moment of that alone. She wanted him, not just for protection, but for something deeper, something she hadn't allowed herself to name. "You could have been killed," she whispered, voice shaking. He reached out, gently brushing a stray lock of hair from her face. "I've faced death plenty of times. I've always come back, and I'm coming back for you every time if I have to." Clara's eyes met his, searching for a flicker of doubt but found none. Only certainty, strength, and a fierce protectiveness that made her chest ache. She wanted to push him away, to retreat into the safety of her pride, but the thought of standing alone against the world again made her shiver with fear. "You're not leaving," she said finally, voice barely more than a breath. "I'm not," he said simply, leaning closer. "Not while you're here. Not while there's a storm outside, a pack of wolves nearby, or a threat at the edge of this ridge. You're not facing any of it alone." Clara's fingers tightened around the scarf at her neck, her pulse racing. She had survived the fire, the winters, the wolves. But she had never survived a storm inside herself, the storm of desire, fear, and hope that Elias had brought with him. He lifted her chin with a rough, gentle hand. "You've endured too much to face the world by yourself. I won't let you." For the first time, Clara felt the weight of her isolation lift, if only slightly. The cabin, once a refuge against the cruelty of the mountains, now felt alive with warmth and protection. She could feel Elias's presence, steady and unwavering, a promise that she no longer had to bear the burden of survival alone. Outside, the wind rattled the logs and stirred the snow along the ridge, but inside by the fire the cabin was quiet and safe. Clara let herself sink back against the rough wall, exhaling a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Elias settled beside her, keeping a careful distance but close enough to be a shield against the world. He didn't speak, allowing silence to fill the space between them. A silence that no longer felt heavy but comforting. I don't know if I can trust this," Clara admitted finally, voice low. "You don't have to," he said, a hint of a smile tugging at his lips. "I'll prove it to you every day. You won't have to face another storm alone." The cabin, the mountains, the ridge, they all seemed to shrink around them, as though the world itself had conceded this small space to their fragile truce. Clara looked into the fire, then back at him, and realized something she had never admitted. She wanted him to stay. She wanted the warmth he brought, the safety, the steady presence that promised she would never be alone again. And for the first time in 2 winters, she allowed herself to believe it. Elias Boone, the rich mountain man, would not leave. And she, Clara Dane, the scarred survivor, would not send him away. By summer, the snow had finally melted from the valley, leaving the Montana town below Black Elk Ridge dusted with fresh grass, wildflowers, and the scent of river water warming in the sun. Clara Dane rode into town beside Elias Boone, her scar exposed beneath the brim of her hat. For the first time in years, she felt the heat of eyes on her, not in judgment but in curiosity. The townspeople had heard the rumors. The scarred woman who survived 2 brutal winters alone, now seen with the rich mountain man. As they approached the general store, whispers began to ripple through the crowd. Merchants paused in their work, children stopped playing, and even the old blacksmith set down his hammer to watch. "Is that Clara Dane?" a woman murmured to her neighbor, voice tight with disbelief. "And she's riding with Elias Boone?" "She's alive," the neighbor replied. "But look at that scar, and she survived all those winters alone." Clara kept her eyes forward, riding tall and steady in the saddle. Though her pulse quickened at the attention, she had become accustomed to solitude where the only judgment came from the cold and the wolves. People staring, whispering, reminded her that the world she had fled was still out there, waiting. Elias guided his horse beside her, calm as ever. He noticed the stares and murmurs but said nothing, letting her take the lead. She noticed the way his presence steadied her, like a tether to the world she had almost given up on. The merchant who had once refused to sell her sugar or even meet her gaze now came forward, his hands raised in awkward greeting. "Clara Dane," he said, bowing slightly. I hear you've survived the mountains. Coffee, sugar, anything you need, it's yours. No charge." Clara's lips twitched, a smile threatening to break through her normally stern expression. "Thank you," she said simply. It was the first time she had accepted kindness in years, and it felt strange, almost foreign. Children who had whispered her name behind fences now stared openly, some pointing, others tugging at their mother's skirts. Yet Clara found herself holding her head high, proud despite the whispers. She was no longer the victim of tragedy. She was a survivor, strong enough to face the mountains and the world alike. Elias kept his hand lightly resting near the hilt of his rifle, a silent warning that while the town might stare, no one would harm her while he was near. He also understood the delicate dance of Clara's pride, allowing her space to navigate the gossip without interference, yet never letting her face the world truly alone. Later, as they passed the blacksmith's shop, the old man shook his head in quiet admiration. "I'll be damned," he muttered to no one in particular. "She's tougher than any man I know." Clara glanced at him briefly, eyes softening before focusing on the road ahead. She felt the subtle shift in the town's perception. She was no longer just the scarred widow who had lost everything. Now she was someone who had endured impossible winters, who had survived wolves, snow, and isolation, and someone who had captured the attention of Elias Boone, a man whose reputation alone commanded respect. As the sun dipped lower, casting golden light across the valley, Clara realized the town's whispers mattered little compared to the bond she shared with Elias. His quiet confidence, his unyielding presence, and the protection he offered were more significant than any rumor. She had learned to survive, yes, but she was learning something new, to be seen without fear, without shame, and without hiding behind walls of pride. By the time they reached the edge of town, the villagers had returned to their daily routines. Though whispers still floated through the air, Clara kept her head high, riding beside Elias, feeling a warmth she hadn't known for years. The scar remained, the memories remained, but so did a newfound strength. A strength not born from solitude, but from survival shared with someone who refused to let her face the world alone. For the first time, Clara Dane walked and rode proudly, knowing that she had endured the wilderness, the storms, and the whispers, and that she would endure whatever came next. And beside her, Elias Boone remained steadfast, a reminder that survival was no longer just about living. It was about being alive, together. The late summer sun bathed the ridge in golden light, warming the earth and softening the shadows of Black Elk Ridge. Clara Dane stood outside her cabin, watching the mountains stretch endlessly before her, the crisp air carrying the scent of pine, earth, and melting snow. She adjusted the scarf around her neck, her scar exposed to the sunlight. For the first time in years, she didn't flinch under its gaze. She had survived fire, wolves, hunger, isolation, and now she was surviving something entirely new. The quiet, persistent claim of Elias Boone on her life. Elias rode up the slope, his horse moving steadily, as if it knew the terrain better than any guide could teach it. He dismounted, boots crunching in the thawed snow, and approached her without hesitation. His eyes, gray-blue and unwavering, met hers. There was no need for words. She already knew why he had come. "You're leaving?" she asked softly, though her heart thudded against her ribs. He shook his head, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "No," he said simply. "Not now, not ever. I told you before, Clara. I'm not leaving you to face this ridge alone." She swallowed, feeling a mix of pride and fear rise within her. She had faced winters that would have killed most men, yet the thought of surrendering her independence, even for safety, was difficult. "Elias, I've survived this long alone. I can do it again." His gaze softened but didn't waver. "You've survived, yes. But surviving alone isn't living, Clara. You don't have to keep proving your strength to the world or to yourself. I want to share the life you've fought to keep." Clara's chest tightened. For years her pride had been a shield, guarding her from pain, rejection, and disappointment. But beneath it, a fragile part of her longed for connection, for warmth, for someone who refused to leave despite the hardships. Elias was that someone. She looked at him, studying the quiet determination etched into his face, the kind of determination that could move mountains, calm storms, and protect those who had no other shield. "You don't understand," she whispered. "I've lost too much. If I let someone in, I could lose them too." He stepped closer, closing the distance between them, yet never forcing it. His hand hovered near hers, an invitation and a promise. "I know what loss is. I've carried it myself. But I'm not afraid of the storm, Clara. Not if it means being with you. You've survived fire, wolves, and winter alone. Believe me, the world outside the mountains won't break us." Her breath caught in her throat. She wanted to speak, to resist, to flee back to the safety of solitude, but the truth she had avoided for years surged forward. She did not want to be alone. Not now, not ever again. Elias reached out, brushing the back of her hand with a tenderness that made her knees weak. "You don't have to choose survival over life. You can have both, with me." Clara closed her eyes, letting the warmth of his hand, his presence, and the golden sunlight wash over her. The scar that had haunted her for years felt like less a mark of shame and more a testament to the life she had endured. And standing there, she realized that her heart could survive again. This time not alone, but together with someone who refused to let go. She opened her eyes and met his gaze, steady and unwavering. "Then I'd stay," she whispered. "Stay with me." Elias's smile broke fully this time, radiant and certain. "Always," he said, pulling her gently into the embrace she had long denied herself. The mountains stretched on endlessly around them, silent witnesses to the life they had fought for. Wolves howled in the distance, rivers sang, and the wind whispered through the pines, but inside that cabin, on that ridge, there was only warmth, safety, and a bond forged in hardship. Courage and trust. Clara Dane, the scarred survivor, finally allowed herself to be seen, to be loved and to live, not just survive. And Elias Boone, the man who refused to let her go, remained steadfast beside her, the promise of protection and devotion as certain as the mountains themselves. For the first time, she knew that surviving wasn't enough. Living together, facing the world side by side was everything.